So both sides are looking for a way out of this. Neither side wants to go, all the way to nuclear war for Cuba, but the fact of the matter is that there is this Soviet task force sailing for Cuba. President Kennedy has ordered the United States Navy to intercept that task force if it dares to enter this area around Cuba. Adlai Stevenson is doing diplomacy at the UN. Dobrynin is doing diplomacy in Washington, D.C. The entire world is on edge. Everyone knows that this confrontation is going on. It leads the news, obviously, every single night. It's a game of nuclear chicken. Who is going to blink first? Kennedy or Khrushchev? In the end, it was the Soviets who blinked. Khrushchev ordered his ships to turn around and to sail for home. He ordered the evacuation of the missiles from Cuba. Castro was incensed. He did not expect Khrushchev to back down, and Castro's rage was terrible to behold. Behind the scenes, a deal had been worked out, and the particulars of the deal that were released to the press in 1961 made it seem that the United States had won this Cold War confrontation. That from what came out in 1961, it was clear that obviously the Soviet missiles were gone, the Soviet ships had turned around. Soviet troops stayed in Cuba. What the United States gave up was a promise not to invade Cuba to remove Castro from power and to give up the quarantine so that Soviet ships could trade and supply Cuba just with everything except for nuclear weapons. At a time, this seems to be a great victory for Kennedy, that all the United States promises to do is not invade Cuba in exchange for a removal of the missiles. However, history has shown that the deal was much more equitable than it seemed at the beginning. The United States had to remove its own medium and intermediate range missiles from Greece and Turkey. So in the end, what you kind of got was kind of an even deal, almost. No missiles in Cuba, but the United States had to remove missiles from where there already were in NATO allies, Greece and Turkey. The Soviets could continue to supply the Cubans, but in the long run, this was the closest the superpowers ever came to actually shooting at each other a hot war. This is the closest the world ever came to full-scale nuclear conflict. But what in the end happened was both sides realized that Cuba was simply not important enough to really go the whole distance on, and not a single shot was fired. The superpowers pulled back from the brink, and thank God for it. Kennedy comes out of this salvaging his reputation that took a hit during the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy comes out of this smelling like a rose, largely because the real particulars of the deal were kept secret from the press for a very long time. It costs Khrushchev his job. Khrushchev is blamed by the Communist Party in Russia for bungling the Cuban Missile situation, and he was blamed for having to publicly backtrack in the face of Kennedy's firmness. 2 years after the Bay of Pigs, and 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, citing, most importantly, the fact that the Soviets blinked first and were embarrassed, removed Khrushchev from power and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who would be the Soviet leader for the next generation until the early 1980s. One thing that did, and here's just a good picture of the quarantine. There's a U.S. Navy electronics warfare plane flying over the Soviet ships heading for Cuba. Here's just an image of Kennedy and Khrushchev, who was going to blink first. And in the end, it was Khrushchev that blinked. One good thing that did sort of come out of this was that it became realized, I guess, that in case of a crisis like this, it was really important for the leadership of both countries to be able to directly communicate. that there was no way for Kennedy to talk to Khrushchev directly through a translator in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they both kind of had to depend on other people to do their communicating for them. And so installed in the White House and in the Kremlin was a special telephone line known as the hotline, where in case of an emergency, and it was constantly staffed with translators and everything like that. In case of an emergency, the two leaders could directly talk to each other over this hotline to try to diffuse tensions. And the telephones on this hotline were installed all over the White House, even in the bathroom. The president could literally pick up the red phone and ring directly the premier of the Soviet Union. The Cold War over Cuba in the early 60s was as hot as the Cold War would get when it came to direct relations between the superpowers. And for an entire week in October of 1962, the entire world kind of collectively held its breath, hoping and praying that the leadership of both the United States and the Soviet Union would extract itself from the mess that had been created over America's Cuba policy, that without the catastrophe of the Bay of Pigs, this never would have happened. And although Kennedy deserves the credit for not going to war, it was Kennedy's, bungled production at the Bay of Pigs that even allowed such a thing to happen in the first place. So Kennedy's responsibility in Cuba, is definitely has its pros and its cons. But in the end, I guess the only important thing was the fact that we didn't go to nuclear war. And the world survived to live another day. The Cuban people still groaned under the oppression of, the awful Castro brothers. But it did not mean the end of the world. Like, it came pretty close to meaning in October of 1962.